Okay, guys, let's look at the chapter 15 reflections, cultural borrowing and its hazards. The cultural transformations, religion and science that we've looked at in chapter 15, these ideas shape people's mental or cultural worlds and influence their behavior. And the development of early modern ideas took place in an environment of great cultural borrowing. Borrowing was selective, borrowing sometimes caused serious conflict, and foreign ideas and practices were often domesticated. Early modern ideas of today see the survival of various ideas from the early modern era. The Western Hemisphere is solidly Christian, and the Wahhabi Islam dominates Saudi Arabia. Religious borrowing, Christianity in the Philippines, Siberia, and even Native American communities. Islam in Asia and Africa, and Sikhism's roots in Islam and Hinduism all illustrate the significance of religious borrowing. Yet borrowing was not always absolute, as some converts to Islam or Christianity did not adopt the absolute monotheism of these faiths. And the conflict and accommodation in cultural borrowing, many cases of cultural borrowing could produce serious conflicts, such as moments of rejecting the outside influence, as with the Taki Onkyo in Peru and the Chinese and Japanese intolerance of Christian missionaries. Sometimes conflict could arise when one power wanted to be sure the culture doing the borrowing did so in an orthodox manner. Like it had to be done in a certain way. Yet also common are examples of borrowing where accommodations were made between existing and newly arrived traditions, as seen in the Native American identification of Catholic saints with their local gods. And so these are some things to keep in mind about cultural borrowing and its hazards. Okay. All right, here's our first image from chapter 15 by, I'm not sure if I'm going to say the last name correctly, Peter Senredem, interior of a Dutch Reformed church, and the Catholic Baroque style interior of a pilgrimage church in Austria. You could see a significant difference in these two churches. So what obvious differences do you notice between these two? What kind of emotional responses would each of them have evoked? The Catholic Church is much more ornate than the Protestant Church. It contains both statues and paintings, and even the layout of the two churches is very different. See, the high altar in the apse of the Catholic Church is the focal point, while the pulpit at the central crossing of the Protestant Church is its focal point. Right? And the lavish interior of this Catholic Church may have appealed to the senses, provoking an emotional response of mystery and awe and grandeur towards God. But the more sparse Protestant Church may have promoted a more inward or quiet reflection on God. It may have also reminded parishioners that they should rely on only God's grace rather than worldly objects. Okay, how might Protestants and Catholics have reacted upon entering each other's churches? Both would have noticed immediately the differences in decoration, right, and layout of the churches. And they may have also noticed the presence or lack of holy intercessors and the relative separation or lack of separation between the laity and the clergy of the two. Now keep in mind that visual source 15:1, the Protestant church, is a painting. And what do you think the artist showed the people disproportionately small? I mean, they look tiny. Right? Tiny people. Well, the artist did so for aesthetic effect, right? To allow the building to be the center of attention and the people placed into the background. And there are no obvious religious reasons for depicting people as so disproportionately small, because the congregation is worshiping rather than the church itself. And that which was what made the place holy. Okay, cultural blending in Andean Christianity. I love this image. This is fantastic. What is Mary's relationship to the heavenly beings standing above her? God the Father on the right, the dove symbolizing the Holy Spirit in the center, and then Jesus to the left. All right, God on the right, Holy Spirit, and Jesus. Well, the heavenly beings standing above Mary illustrate that she's the one chosen by God to be the mother of Jesus. Right? And the presence of the minors show that she is a compassionate protector and intercessor on their behalf with Jesus and God. Right? And the crown might represent her status, right, as Queen of Heaven, while her outstretched arms might represent her use of this status to help people on earth. So that would probably, I would say that's the, her relationship to God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, as well as even the miners that are working in the mountain, right, mining that silver. What is the significance of the crown, right, and the outstretched arms? There we go. She's the Queen of Heaven, and she's representing her status to those people that she can help. Now, the European figures at the bottom are shown in a posture of prayer or even thanksgiving. What might the artists have been trying to convey? How would you interpret the relative size of the European and Andean figures? Well, these are traditional postures, believe it or not, for figures in Marian paintings, and so they may merely be for artistic convention. This is what we've always done. Or the postures may reflect thanksgiving for the riches of Potosí in Bolivia, the miners, the silver miners, which had proven so crucial to the rise of Catholic Spain and their dominance around the world and the global market. And the relative size may reflect the tradition of the painting of the highest status figures and patrons of the painting disproportionately large. Right? Alternatively, and you might interpret the sizes as a reflection of the oppressed or dominated state of indigenous peoples, including the indigenous elites. Now, why do you think the artist placed Mary actually inside the mountain rather on it, while depicting her dress in a mountain-like form? I think that's very interesting. Depicting Mary within a geological feature might be syncretic, reflecting pre-Christian beliefs that gods and spirits dwell in mountains and other features in the landscape, right? They're part of the earth. And because of the positioning of her face on the mountain peak and her robe representing the richly fertile silver mountain of Potosí, the artist may have even been intentionally linking her with the Earth Mother goddess, who is associated with the mountain peaks and fertility. That's also a possibility and a very interesting note. Okay. Here we go. Oh, this one's great. Making Christianity Chinese. So what specifically Chinese elements can you identify in this image? We see a lone tree and a scholar rock in the background where they were typical of Chinese landscape paintings. I don't know if you guys remember, but we saw some of these that were done on silk with ink at the Kimball Art Museum. The house and furniture suggest the dwelling of a wealthy Chinese scholar. The reading table in front of Mary was a common item in the homes of Chinese literary elite. And the clouds that appear at the angel's feet and around the shaft of light are associated with sacred Buddhist and Taoist figures, believe it or not. So, to whom might this image have been directed? Who was this for? Well, the image may have been directed toward an elite Chinese audience who is literate and familiar with Buddhist and Taoist ideas. And how would they have responded to this image, those educated Chinese? Well, they may have found the symbols and imagery familiar, making it easier to understand and interpret the print and its message. And it's also possible that an educated Chinese viewer might misinterpret the print as a Buddhist scene. Now, the European engraving on which this Chinese print was modeled included in the background the scene of Jesus' crucifixion. Now, why might the Chinese artist have chosen to omit that scene from this image? Well, China might not have had a tradition of depicting events that were separated in time and space within the same image. That's entirely possible. Or it's possible that a more traditional Chinese landscape scene would be more familiar to the viewer, thus creating that scene in this picture, in this image. All right, and the last one, Christian art at the Mughal court. So why do you think that this Mughal painter portrayed Mary and Joseph as rather distinguished and educated persons rather than the humble carpenter and his peasant wife, as in so many other European images? Why might he have placed the family in a rather palatial surroundings instead of a stable? Well, this painting was for an elite audience, and therefore the depiction of educated persons of courtly status seems more appropriate than an inn, a stable at an inn. And the Mughal artist and patron were less concerned with getting the details of the Christian story correct, and probably more concerned with the aesthetic impact of the painting. Now, the Mughal emperors were less concerned with ensuring that all the details of the Christian story were faithfully rendered than with creating an aesthetically pleasing composition or image. And the palatial surroundings were a familiar genre in Mughal court paintings. So how do you imagine European missionaries responded to this, of the whole, this representation of the Holy Family? Some European missionaries might have viewed this painting as a positive development, as it reflected an interest in Jesus and Mary at court, but others might have responded more negatively since the painting depicts the scene inaccurately, and they might believe it deliberately misrepresents the story. Now, can you see any similarities between the Indian image and the Chinese print? Pay attention to the setting, the clothing, the class status of the human figures, and the scenes outside the windows. In both, the figures are placed in elite settings with elite furnishings. They're dressed in elite clothing, right? Although the styles reflect specific cultural traditions, and they're clearly upper class in their background. Now, Mary in Visual Source 15.4 and Joseph in Visual Source 15.5 are shown as literate. And in both images, the backgrounds depict natural scenes. Now, while the 15.4 draws on Chinese motifs, the Visual Source in 15.5 draws on European motifs. And that's our reflections and visual sources from chapter 15. Keep it up. You guys are doing awesome.